All right, it looks like the stream is back. I apologize for that was probably on my side. I don't know what caused it, but my apologies. I Cass, can you remind me what we were just talking about before my thing cut off?
I believe we were talking about playing too many copies of Bowmaster and having a sort of a bad macro plan post board against certain matchups.
Yes. So, essentially, I want my 75, or sorry, my 60 post board to be as clean cut, similar to the Delver matchup we talked about, 6 in, 6 out, or whatever it be, maybe 10 in, 10 out post board against all of the popular matchups that are heavily represented, and having four endurance main deck allows for that. While as Bowmaster, because I'm gonna have endurance in my deck regardless because it's turn zero interaction. The impact is just
Right.
higher. Whereas Bowmasters, to be honest, I think even against the cantrip decks, it's kind of weak in our deck because we just want cards that are good all the time, such as the Hierarchs. And to me, at least, the Bowmasters is a little bit more situation. Not to mention the impact it has on our mana base, right?
Right. And I think for a card to be something situational that we play in our main deck, it has to be lights out in a matchup like Oof. Um,
Or Bog, right?
right, or Bog, yeah. And Bog sort of has a lot of utility in random spots. Like even against, against Painter, it gets a Welder activation. Against Control, it can get an Uro if they're playing that.
Right, and then even
Um,
against the most represented deck in the last 10 years since Top got banned, right? Like against Delver,
right.
you're turning off their Murktide region, or in historically speaking, it'd be like even Tarmogoyf or something like that, right? Or Dreadhorde when it was legal.
Right. And endurance does all of those things too, while also again being a body. And something that actually comes up a lot for me that I think people don't see enough is
Mhm.
using endurance as like a +1 mana on a crucial turn where you're trying to natural order.
Speaking of which,
Pitch
I'm
cat.
glad you brought that up. How
Okay.
many times did that come up during your event, if any?
I think it came up twice during Eternal Weekend and once during the Duel for Duels the week before.
Mm.
Um,
So you got to
mostly,
sorry, go ahead.
it's usually only important in matchups where you're trying to race them with a natural order, but
Mhm.
in those spots it's very important.
Right. It's the so you got to do the turn two natural order. Sounds like two times during Eternal Weekend, which is before, presumably Atraxa, right?
Yeah, well, I think the second one was actually like a turn 7 one in a game where there was a lot of attrition.
Gotcha, gotcha. So that is pretty sweet. I guess for the audience, can you say what matchup it was against?
I believe that one was against
Here are your matchups, by the
the.
way. I put it on the screen.
I believe that was against the lands player, the second lands opponent.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
Um,
That is, yeah. I actually updated my Patreon. One of the content I produced today to to say the role in the matchup, and I think against lands we want to just be a combo deck, right?
mhm.
And that kind of fits the playstyle you just mentioned.
The other thing that I think is really worth talking about with regards to deck construction is sort of the talk of the weekend is invigorate. Um,
um, Go ahead. I'll let you. The floor is yours, and then I'll ask what is your best invigorate story afterwards. Because I had one person ask me specifically to ask you.
sure. I love the invigorate in this deck. I think it's worse now that it's a known quantity. I'm still interested in playing some number, but
Hmm.
mostly because of how good it is in the Delver matchup. But the card creates a lot of awkward situations. Against my initiative opponent, I just attack with a 1/2 hierarch very confidently,
Hmm.
and he just like, I guess I have to take it, and he took it, and then a couple turns later, I had exactly lethal. I was like exactly 1 point, I would have been 1 point shy if I didn't make that attack, and I had the
Wow.
invigorate, so I could have punished and killed the Archon or gotten in for a free point. Um, but I think mostly it's just a way to fight Orcish Bowmasters, a card that when you're on the draw, if Delver has a Bowmaster, I think the matchup is very hard. If you're on the play and they have a Bowmaster, it's winnable.
Hmm.
But if you're on the draw and you have an Invigorate, you can beat a Bowmaster. And if you lead turn one Allosaurus Shepherd with an Invigorate in hand, I feel like the game is just over on the spot.
Yeah, I think so my experience with that is I think if you're on the play, Bowmasters is pretty bad to be honest against us. I think it's very slow.
Mhm.
All our stuff is very fast, like one mana stuff. I think on the draw, it's situationally hard. So what I mean by that is my experience is If you're on the draw and they have Bowmaster plus additional pressure and
Hmm.
disruption, I think those are the games that are hard to win. But if it's just Bowmaster by itself and with maybe little pressure, I don't think it is that big a deal. I think you can overcome that. But Invigorate does let you flip, essentially be on the play, right?
Right. Invigorate also has a really cool effect of being able to just play a Fiend Artisan as a 1/1 in the face of a Lightning Bolt.
Mm-hmm. Or
And
Bowmaster.
Fiend Artisan, yeah, exactly. And Fiend Artisan just gets to be like a pack rat in a lot of matchups because of that.
Yeah,
Um,
okay. So I'm glad we touched on this because, in my experience, obviously this is an overgeneralization, or sorry, simplification, right? To me, untapping with a Fiend Artisan is game over. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I think in a lot of matchups, yes. I think it's the number of matchups where that's the case is getting smaller.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, if I get to untap with a Fiend Artisan and like any amount of material resources, I feel pretty far ahead.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Really, if I untap with a Fiend Artisan and a Cradle in play, I feel like that's when the game is truly over.
Gotcha. Okay. So I guess since um we're on the topic, what are the examples when you don't feel the game is over with Fiend Artisan untapped with mana, outside of maybe against combo, where oof is not like relevant, and maybe some strange board state. I'm blanking off the top of my head, but I guess allow you to clarify on that.
The biggest one is the Beans matchup, where
Mm-hmm.
Beanstalk proper lets them really snowball advantage.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because like a Fiend Artisan, I can find a second Fiend Artisan, or I can find a Grist, or I can find an Endurance to disrupt their graveyard, but they can just chain a Leyline Binding into a Triumph, and then I have to find a Grist the next turn, and Grist takes you down two creatures to kill their Triumph, and they can just hit their Triumph again. I really do feel like the matchups where they have Beanstalk
Mm-hmm.
or a deck that I have a lot of respect for is the Ocean Soul 94, I think his handle is, Jeskai list with Supreme Verdicts.
Is that the Days Undoing Jeskai deck that you're referring to?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Supreme Verdict as a card is pretty tough for us, especially when like they have Mystic Sanctuary in the deck.
Right, and especially if we cannot stick a Gris.
Right, right. When I was playing two Grist, the matchup felt a lot easier. One of my good friends plays it a lot. But Layer of the Hydra helps there. But yeah, for the most part, I think that like those are the spots where I don't feel like Artisan is a total lockout.
Hmm.
Weirdly, I kind of feel like Artisan is a total lockout against Painter because they're just so bad at assembling the combo in the face of the disruption that we have.
Yeah, I think we just turned into a hard control deck, right? And
Yeah,
Artisan has just tons of text, like in terms of like every creature matters, if that makes sense.
right. Actually, I have a really good story about my match against Painter in round four.
Uh huh. Let me
Played
bring it up.
against a fellow by the name of Jacob, who I cast two Force of Vigors in a game where I was taking three attacks from Chaos Defiler. I just took 15.
Mm-hmm.
The first time I killed two Construct tokens with from Urza Saga. The second time I killed a Shadow Spear and a Great Furnace.
Mm-hmm.
And I basically just was like, I had to play the whole game, not getting rid of the Defiler because I was so resource light. Um,
Makes sense. You
and
you don't want
after
them to choke you on mana, right?
Right. And after our match, he like tracked me down to be like, "Hey, you played that game really well." And I just want to shout him out for being a great sport and just like an awesome opponent. And it was a really good match against Painter.
That's really awesome to hear. I love hearing these good sportsmanship stories. Do you remember what your opponent's last name was, or no?
Oh, I can pull it up. He followed me on Twitter.
Okay.
Uh, Goodness, how do I get to my profile on Twitter anymore?
I mean, no rush. We don't have to do it in real time. I don't want to,
Yeah.
put on any pressure, additional pressure. You're already, spending generously spending your late night here with us.
I do not know his last name, but he has in parentheses Undertaker afterwards, and I hope it's a wrestling reference. So,
Gotcha, got. I think there was something else I believe you wanted to touch on, right? In terms of why you wanted to play this deck, or should we? To me, the most fascinating response you had, and the one that resonated the most with me, was the response to my 10th question. Obviously, it was a generic question, but did you want to touch upon anything before we jump into that?
I wanted to tell the best Invigorate story, actually. It came in game three of round one.
Oh, okay, go ahead.
I was playing against Burn, and I was in a situation where my opponent was at 13.
Mm-hmm.
They had an Eidolon of the Great Revel in play and a tapped Goblin Guide, and I attacked them with an Endurance that had 2 Exalted triggers, and they said no blocks.
Mm-hmm.
I hardcast Invigorate to do 9 to put them at 4 life,
Mm-hmm.
and I had an untapped Hierarch to chump block their Eidolon of the Great Revel.
Mm-hmm.
So I locked them under their Eidolon because they would have had to cast 2 spells to kill me.
Oh,
And we had
that's
2
really
lands in
sweet.
play, so they couldn't double Fire Blast me, so I basically Invigorate hard locked them out of the game.
Wow, that is really heads up
I
magic there.
actually
Because
learned. Oh, good.
oh no, I'll let you finish. Go ahead. I was just gonna that's really heads up is all.
I learned that one from playing the Yawgmoth versus Burn matchup in Modern, of all things. In that matchup, you really just want to let them keep their Eidolons in play and put pressure on them as much as you can. I used to do the thing where I would attack with a Strangleroot Geist with a counter on it, proliferate it twice with Yawgmoth, put them to a low life total, and just sort of lock them under their Eidolon.
Yeah, that all makes sense. Like I haven't played the Burn matchup much, but what you said makes a lot of sense because the few times I have, you get into these weird situations where you just essentially don't want to be able to lose, and in that way, our deck I think resembles a little bit has some of these prison elements where we don't really care about winning. Our opponent just can't win anymore. If that makes sense.
Right. And to address the question in the chat real quick, what does
Hmm.
Invigorate do there? It just was 3 mana for +4 damage. It was just sort of like a surprise trick where my opponent couldn't predict that I was going to have that +4 damage there. They didn't block because they thought they could just take it and then be able to cast 2 spells on their turn and kill me. So yeah, just more of a surprise factor. Yeah, hard casting Invigorate came up multiple times throughout the weekend.
Yeah, that I mentioned this in my Discord that I have lethal in a very low sample size. I think I don't even know the number of leagues, but I think I played Invigorate for like 2 weeks, and I've killed 5 different opponents because of hardcast. And I guess that follow up question for that is like, have you killed anybody with a hardcast Invigorate? Yes, I outside of the Eidolon experience, I guess that's like pseudo kill, right?
I don't believe so. I had in my match against Initiative, I won the game with 2 Invigorates in hand
Mm-hmm.
because like I never had an opportunity to cast them because there was a Archon of Maria in play, and I had them in post board because I was worried about Fury. My opponent, I think, showed me a Fury in game 2.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wanted to make sure I was able to play around that. But yeah, I think they would have been good there, but I didn't have an opportunity to cast them.
That
Um,
makes sense. Also in the initiative matchup, if you look at the posted sideboard map on my Patreon, we are kind of short cards that are relevant, and I think
mhm.
Invigorate neatly at least adds a card with text, even if it's a little bit situational in that matchup.
Right. Speaking of cards for that matchup, I really liked the inclusion of the crop rotation just for all of the non-Force of Will matchups.
Mm-hmm. Just for speed,
Um,
you mean, right?
right, yeah,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
like just being able to double cradle lets you win the game so often with the deck.
No, that makes a lot of sense, and I'm glad you brought that up because it's been a while since I played crop rotation in our list, and we only recently added the package of one crop, one Karagas back because, in my
Right.
testing at least, I didn't full disclosure. I didn't play Eternal Weekend, but I was testing for anybody who subs to the Patreon, and I found Godok Teague like out of specifically depths, which I think is potentially well represented at Eternal Weekend. I know they didn't post any top 8 finishes, but I found Garati out of that deck kind of problematic, and
Mhm.
because what it does strategically is it allows your opponent to just save removal for Artisan, and we're like kind of locked out of the game. And I did not want that situation to happen to anybody that, including yourself, obviously, who played Eternal Weekend. And coincidentally, that the crop rotation has just been like you said, nuts against some of these
Yeah.
non-blue decks because they can't stop what we're doing. To put it frankly.
Yeah, I actually there's a local who plays a lot of green white depths, and I played a team tournament about 3 weeks ago where I lost to him in the Swiss and the top eight,
Mm-hmm.
which are top four rather.
Mm-hmm.
And that matchup feels pretty tough. And I was playing 2 Pithing Needles at the time, and actually before I had subscribed to your Patreon again, I kind of was going in and out, and then I came to a conclusion of 72 of your 75. The 3 differences were the needles, which I read your reasoning and they became rotation and Crocus immediately, and the other change was the -1 fetch land +1. Um, Allosaurus Shepherd, and I only knew about the Invigorates because one of my buddies lost to it on Moto.
That's funny. So are you saying you independently came to 73 of the 75 list prior to subbing? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, it's a 72. Yeah,
Sorry,
I
72,
think
yeah. But that's
yeah,
really go ahead.
I think the only difference other than that was just I played the fetch lands that I happened to own.
Right, I mean any green fetch will do. I don't really count that as a difference. On the topic of the fetch land, I'm glad you reminded me. How did the 22 lands feel? Because I know I can be ultra conservative, and I know people have like complained about flood with this deck, right? Did you feel 22 lands was okay, or did you miss maybe the fetch land at any point?
Um, I felt like 22 lands was okay. Honestly, if I'm adding another land, I kind of want to add a third Bayou,
Mm-hmm.
because of the prevalence that we have four snuff outs and three invigorates in the 75.
Right.
I think if I did add it, I would hate it, and I'd probably just immediately cut it after like 3 or 4 games. But
Yeah,
yeah, I think
I'm
22 lands was enough.
yeah, I'm of the opinion the third bayou is nice if you just like are a little bit, I mean, for lack of a better term, sloppy with fetching. I think if you're
Yeah,
careful, you don't need it, but mental toll is definitely a thing, and I've been there where like, okay, I fetch, without thinking, and suddenly I'm out of bayous. If that makes sense.
right.
I
And
think on.
speaking of mental toll, round 9 of day one, when I
Mhm.
played against. By the way, my only two losses in the tournament were to first and second place. Just throwing that out there. Um,
I love hearing that because I think that kind of validates further that like obviously you have to be lucky slash play well slash pick a good, like, to me the three ingredients to doing well at any big event is you have to pick a good deck that has a ample power level. I think you have to
right.
play well, and I think you have to get a little lucky. And I think all three things were probably accurate in this case.
Yeah. And when I played against Jay in round 9, we were both super fatigued.
Uh,
And game one, I made a small error that snowballed out of control. And then game two, I made a small error, and then he made a small error, but his was slightly less impactful, and he ended up drawing the second lightning bolt to kill me.
mhm.
But honestly, other than that, I didn't really feel like any sort of toll kind of came on me because I spent so much time preparing. Every matchup I sat down, my opponent played their first card, and I was like, I know everything that matters here. And that's sort of the confluence of preparation meets opportunity, right?
Yes. I'm glad you mentioned that too because like I know a lot of times the reality is like a good percentage of the subs that I get are people are looking to pick up the deck and then obviously they don't have the time to like study, and I get that, I understand that that's like time is money as well, right? But I'm
Right.
glad to hear that your preparation paid off because you always felt fully prepared. um, I want to, since we're somewhat on the topic, your other loss I know was in the top four to control, and
Yep.
it. Unless you wanted to talk about something else first, I know that some of the Cradle pilots in the community have struggled with the control matchup. I personally think it's pretty even. That's my personal opinion. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe can you offer them some tips or advice that I know I have lacking to do because I have not been able to convince players that the matchup is, to me at least, is pretty even.
I think it's fairly close, largely because their cards are so clunky.
Mm-hmm.
You're like a Delver deck, and they're kind of like miracles. It really does. I compared the deck multiple times throughout the weekend to Tom Ross Infect.
Mm-hmm.
In that, when Tom Ross Infect deck, sometimes the card that mattered was the Ink Moth Nexus, sometimes it was the Glistener Elf, but sometimes it was just the Noble Hierarch that you were going to invigorate and berserk for exactly lethal, right? Like you have to both put threats into play, multiple avenues of threats, and your opponent has to pick the right ones to answer every time. And actually, it wasn't streamed. My game three against TK, it was just an incredible game where um, the culmination of it was I saw an opportunity to thought seize him, make him think the game was about the three plus-sized Elvish Reclaimers I had in play,
Mm-hmm.
and he brainstormed and then attacked the Triumph of St. Catherine. I double blocked, which shuffled the top 7 cards of his library,
Mm-hmm.
which put the Swords to Plowshares that he put back in a random spot.
Mm-hmm.
And he passed the turn, and I was looking at the board, and I realized that I had a 1 in 44 shot of losing the tournament if
Mm-hmm.
I drew the Attracts at a natural order 4. And I drew it, which bad beats, but I really was able to just like make the game about combat when actually it was about natural order in my hand, and he had to brainstorm away a Force of Will and a Swords to Plowshares on a turn
Mm-hmm.
where he got into combat with a Triumph. Um, I think the matchup is really like kind of Delvery, kind of Infecty, where you're trying to present a threat, make
Mm-hmm.
them answer that while you're also developing your next threat. And this deck does that really well through the prospect of having even things like Fiend Artisan are threats. Things like Allosaurus Shepherd is a threat because it represents an uncounterable natural order. Things
Mm-hmm.
like Grist are your threats have a lot of there's a lot of dynamism in the way that your threats work, and you can force your opponent into bad situations, especially when they're playing a bunch of cards like Triumph of St. Catherine and Up the Beanstalk that are strong if they line up correctly and you have the time to line them up correctly.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned all that. I have two comments following up to your statement there. I think the first one is I'm glad you mentioned the fighting on two axis thing. One of the tips I've mentioned in the past is like if you could get into a situation where you resolve a grist and still have board presence to pressure like an almost like an aggro deck or tempo deck, I think you're probably winning that game because they have to answer on two different axes. I think the second question I have is, or second comment I have to make is, did you miss the second grist, and how did you feel about my or our list going down to one lately?
I think one Grist is okay. Um, Against 4 colors is a spot where I miss it the most, probably.
Mm-hmm.
But I've actually found that playing 4 copies of Endurance subsidizes one-ofs quite a bit.
What can you
I
can you
had a
elaborate on that a little
game,
bit?
yeah, I had a game against Grixis Delver where Grist died, and I ended up Endurancing myself and then found it again with
Gotcha.
a Fiend Artisan. I actually also, at the Duel for Duels the week before, I played against a very cool mono blue paradoxical outcome, the One Ring deck, and my
Mm-hmm.
opponent, I was on the play, I ran out of Collector Reef, and he forced it, because I figured playing it on turn 2 was better than not playing it. And the next turn, I pitch cast Endurance on myself, Zenith for it, put Oof into play, and he conceded.
I love that play. I've only been able to or have been fortunate to make that play. I think like no more than a handful of times for sure, and it's really nice when it comes out. That's like really refreshing to hear.
Yeah, and I think because you have the Endurances to subsidize the Grist count in a way, because you can never have 2 Grists in play.
Right.
So, and obviously, like some games you can't afford to do that and you lose because of it, but
Mm-hmm.
for the most part, if the Grist gets to kill 1 creature or gets to like sit and play and produce creatures for 2 turns, it's probably done more than enough in the matchup.
Mm-hmm.
I think especially a lot of legacy pilots who come to playing decks, they look for ways to win games that were probably not going to be winnable anyways. And I think the second Grist is really one of those cards.
Mm-hmm.
In a game where you have to get a Grist into play, have it die, get a second Grist into play, either
Mm-hmm.
you're barely scraping by, or you're probably fighting an uphill battle that was probably better off being won by just trying to spike a natural order.
Yeah, no, I completely feel you on that because um at least lately with the way the deck has been fine tuned slash nearing final form, if you want to call it that. The number of games where a resolve where I wanted a second grist exactly, I found to be very low because usually the first one runs the way of the game, and it's only in strange situation where like you naturally draw and then it dies or something like that where it actually matters because I found especially lately too where the control matchup, if you can make them think the game is about Fiend Artisan or Green Sun for three, and your follow up is just natural order in hand, then it doesn't really matter, right? Like the threat of Grist is enough.
Right. Um, and actually, that brings me to another point where something that I've done a little bit is zenithing for larger numbers than I need to represent
Mm-hmm.
certain things. Um, Sometimes in a game where like I want my opponent to think it's about Grist,
Mm-hmm.
I can zenith for 3, and like they might counter it or not counter it because of that, and then I'll grab a Fiend Artisan or something like that.
Yeah, that is something that comes up quite a lot if you have spare mana, and I think the card that is like scary to represent on our end, like sometimes I'll go to four, and four could be anything, right? Like And
Right.
then 3, obviously, against some of these green decks, that's opposition agent, and I think it forces them to play in an awkward way, or Magus of the Moon, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and speaking of opposition agent,
Hmm.
I've fully resolved to just not playing a way to beat it. If they get it into play and I draw a bunch of cards that let me search my deck, they good beats. Like I can't. You have to sacrifice so much to be able to beat that card consistently.
Right.
And also, I don't think it's worth playing because it's not a green creature. And like in the games where you're artisaning for a opposition agent,
Hmm.
Gadok Teague is probably better, or Oof is probably better, or you're just in a situation where you can just get a Crater Hoof and kill them.
Yeah, I'm fully on board. Obviously, you're preaching to the choir in this because the list I posted for Eternal Weekend. So, for those who are unaware, Cass actually registered 74 of the 75 I posted finalists for Eternal Weekend, and the only difference that she mentioned was the fetch land. Sorry, the shepherd, second shepherd, which I'm sure was fantastic for her instead of the 11th fetch land. And then obviously she mentioned earlier she got wind of the invigorate tech because she said her friend got killed by her or whatever at the same event she played prior. But to me, the answers to opposition agent are just so much worse than the other cards in our deck that I just rather lose the card.
Right.
Like it's it's really only played by one deck in my opinion, the mono black deck,
Yeah.
and so be it, right? Like we just have the one potential, we just scoop to the card if need be, right? Like, and even that, I don't even consider. Even if they have, there's ways to win. I've been on board opposition agent
Yeah.
because against mono black, because you just have an endurance on board, and they're just like, okay, you're just not gonna answer our, 5, 6 attacking every turn, right? Like they have to eventually block.
Right. Actually, speaking of that, I played against in the duel for duels the week before. I played against Reanimator,
Hmm.
and he put the same opposition agent into play 3 times against me, and I just cast and drew a 5/5 Fiend Artisan, and then played the Hierarch and attacked him for 6. Um, and obviously
Yeah,
that's a result of him having an anemic draw, but like you can just draw your cards sometimes.
yeah. I think people underestimate how good the hierarchs really are in our deck, like compared to Birds of Paradise, which I think is unplayable, and compared to Landlord Elves, which is playable but a lot worse.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
oh,
and
sorry,
the reason I actually,
go
oh,
ahead, go
good,
ahead.
good.
I was just gonna say, yeah, I think one unsung thing about hierarchs is people don't realize it just coincidentally allows us to beat the random hate that people think is good against us. So, for instance, the agent obviously is the more extreme example where like obviously we can't be an agent otherwise outside of rare scenarios, but like it's why I don't care about things like what's ensnaring bridge or like these
Hmm.
random things that people mistakenly think are good against us, but actually trap cards.
Yeah, and I think that hierarchs subsidize your worst draws, if that makes sense. Like they power up your cradles the most of any of your other cards. They
Hmm.
make it so that your most anemic attackers are still reasonable,
Hmm.
and they make it so that if your opponent's trying to wasteland you, you still have mana sources in play.
Hmm.
Whereas like Lana War Elves only does one of those things. Birds of Paradise does one of those things.
Yeah, I'm
Um,
glad you mentioned that too because a trend that I know somebody noticed was does every card you play in the 75 have to really serve multiple roles? And I said, yeah, because this is legacy. Like you don't like I don't build the deck similar to some of these other decks. I won't say which, but they play cards like Deafening Silence, which really don't comes in like one type of matchup, right? Like I don't really like those
mhm.
kind of cards because the expected EV over a long term and run is low.
Right, and it's actually one of the reasons why I picked this deck. Partially my experience, but also partially I feel like this deck is really strong going into an open field. If I play against 4 Storm players, good beats, I get to drop early and get pizza with my friends.
Hmm.
But I think the average 15 to 18 rounds that I play or whatever with this deck, I'm going to play against primarily matchups where I know are winnable.
Hmm.
Um, and I think trying to hedge for the matchups that are really bad by playing super narrow things just make you so much worse in the aggregate. I always joke that this is the Moneyball deck where you don't need the best player, you just need 6 of the most average players.
That's funny. I love that reference because I follow baseball and then I watched the movie. Obviously, like I definitely enjoyed that and something I I get asked a lot is going back to the opposition agent is like, oh, what about dismember because it answers opposition agent or magus, and my answer is always the same. It's like dismember, which is 1 mana, is literally infinitely times more than 0 mana. Like
Yeah.
I don't think people realize how good snuff out is. Like, and I mentioned this before, and I don't know if you saw. Like, I know you only recently subbed to the Patreon about less than 2 weeks ago, but Snuff Out is a card that is unique to us at the moment, and I think it's silly for us to not capitalize on it.
I think the same argument can be made for why we're playing Invigorate over Legolas's Quick Reflexes. I tried playing with Quick Reflexes, and you just never have a mana up when you need it.
Yeah, again, one is infinitely more than zero, and
Right.
I'm glad you mentioned that because like full disclosure, I didn't even play Lego's Quick Reflex because in the way I envisioned it in my head, it was already gonna be not good enough, and I even told a peer of mine who I am very fond of, who wanted to play the card. I told him I just want to save you the trouble. It's not going to be good. And
Yeah.
he asked me not even to test. I said I don't even want to waste my time to test. I already know it's not good enough.
Yeah. I saw the card and I read all the text on it and I got really excited. I
Mm-hmm.
own a playset and I'm sure I'll never play with them. Um, in practice, it's so much worse than it looks. It gets a little bit better if you're playing a bunch of copies of Elvish Spirit Guide, but I think if you're doing that, you're straying down a different path anyways.
Yeah, then you're
Um,
kind of building a house of cards, right? In my opinion, I think the thing about
right.
our deck is it's extremely consistent. Like,
Mhm.
regardless of what our opponent does, our deck is going to be able to power through more often than not.
Yeah, we're really good at cobbling together a game plan, maybe not the best game plan at every time,
Mm-hmm.
through a fair bit of resistance.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I think one of the things that's really strong about that is against the combo decks because, we have this very linear game plan. This is a deck of multiple linear game plans for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And against combo decks, even if they Thoughtseize you, even if they have, a removal spell for your hate bear, you have a second one, or you have, redundancy in Thoughtseizes, or they spend their time answering your hate bears and you put an Atraxa into play and then draw another one. Um, one of the cards that I think really is emblematic of the versatility of the deck is Fiend Artisan, right? Like you get to be redundant and also versatile, which not a lot of decks get to do, and Zenith does the same thing. And we actually we touched on it a little bit earlier. This is my favorite deck in the format, but I also think it was one of the three decks I considered for Eternal Weekend at any point leading up to the event. I strongly considered playing Beans, and I strongly considered playing the Jeskai Ocean Soul deck.
Mm-hmm.
But other than those two, this was the only other deck I considered, and I think it's because it is not just my pet deck, but it's legitimately a good strategy. And I think with recent innovations, the deck is finally in a spot where, like, when a Delver player sits down and they have like 68 to 70 of their 75 kind of pre-locked in?
Yeah.
I think we've hit that point with this deck, where like I think there's maybe 10 slots in the deck I would ever change,
Mm-hmm.
unless the format is shaken up in a huge way.
Yeah, I think I'm glad you mentioned that too because like it's we kind of knew it at the time, but we just weren't pressured into innovating until the initiative era kind of like ran loose, and we had problems keeping up in that time frame because the Delver match was fine. Like in hindsight, it's silly to run like Wirewood Symbiote and Visionary in this deck, but I wasn't forced to figure out what those cuts needed to be at the time, and I think now like yeah, I think this deck feels pretty tight, and I can't imagine changing more than like 5 cards uh, in any given metagame. Like no matter what is at your LGS, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that there are probably other ways to build Cradle decks that might be good. Like I think the Cradle Scam deck is actually pretty interesting,
Mm-hmm.
but that's a fundamentally different deck to me. And it's cool because it feels like, you know, I'd say for the last 4 or so years, Elves was sort of without a real identity. It kind of wasn't great. It was sort of falling behind Fire design stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's cool to see Gaia's Cradle, what I consider to be a pillar of the format, and arguably the strongest card in the format just on raw power level,
Mm-hmm.
uh, have a real identity again, have a real established list. And I think the deck will always be underrepresented because the playset of Gaia's Cradles is so expensive.
Yes.
But at the same time, people picked up Elves back then and they'll pick it up now because people love playing with green cards. uh, I'm a sucker for them. I love Yawgmoth. I love Cradle Control,
Hmm.
um,
I
and it's just really cool to have that be a part of Legacy again.
Yeah, I don't know how much you know about like my past. I In 2020 I won the showcase qualifier with essentially the glimpse list, but with Eldritch
Hmm.
Reclaimer, and that's kind of like where it deviated from the traditional Nettle Sentinel build in the first place. I don't want to harp too much on that. Like a lot of the viewers probably already know the history,
Hmm.
but I think from transitioning from there to this list, the big difference is to make Glimpse of Nature work, you have to play, for lack of a better term, bad cards, right? Like Heritage Druid is not a good card, and neither is
Yep.
Birch Lord Rangers, like in a vacuum. In this deck, you kind of get to play. Each card feels like its legacy power level, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I don't feel like there's any cards that I'm embarrassed to put into play anymore.
I think the one exception to that is, and I know you're big on the Allosaur Shepherd, but to me that is the one card that is kind of like can be embarrassing at times, if that makes sense.
Right. Right.
But fulfills a very, in my opinion, necessary role in the deck because sometimes you play against a Chalice player, you have all one drops in your hand, like you need the out, or from a strategic standpoint, like if your opponent is holding Force of Will and you have Fiend Artisan or Green Sun for one on the stack, that's a must force, right? Like
Right.
no other card you just by having that card in the deck, your opponent has to play differently.
Right. And it's actually part of why I wanted to play the second actual copy of the card because
Mm-hmm.
I think against a lot of the counterspell matchups, just drawing it and then not playing it until the turn you natural order is really good.
Right. It's kind of like what it does is it's difficult to play around when they know it's not a 4-0, right? Like they can't just hedge for it, and if they do, they get punished when you don't have it.
Right. It's like a weird veil of summer in that regard.
Hmm.
I think part of the reason when I was okay with playing a second copy is even in the games where it's just like the worst card in your deck, it's still a crappy root walla, and a crappy root walla still sometimes is enough when you have a Gaia's Cradle in play.
Yeah, it's a 1 mana 1/1, and why we play even the second Arbor still is sometimes the difference between Cradle Hoof being lethal and not.
Yep.
Okay.
Um,
Anything? Okay. I'll leave the floor to you. Any of the other questions here that you want to elaborate on, or it doesn't even have to be one of these questions. It could be just anything on your mind. I know that we have a hard stop at in half an hour, so I do want to leave some room in case Twitch chat has some questions.
um, I want to talk about one of my matches in particular. Let me pull it up here and refresh my memory.
Sure.
Um, it was against the lands player in the second lands player I played against in round five.
Okay.
Um, this is not a slight against the player. I think he might not have been as experienced playing against the Cradle Control deck as some people are.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there was definitely a moment where he was very focused on the mana denial part of the game plan.
Uh huh.
When in reality, if he had just made constructs where there was a saga, I was probably dead. And I
Okay.
think that sort of lends itself to the misdirection part of the deck, where the threat of natural order was enough to force him to warp his game plan. And like he can't see my hand, he can't know that making two 5/5s and then finding a shadow spear and suiting them up would be better.
Mm-hmm.
But because I had access to natural order in my deck, because the Fiend Artisan that was in play could have represented a Crater Hoof or an Atraxa, he had to just use his land for turn to wasteland me.
Mm-hmm.
And the game actually ended with him choosing to wasteland something instead of making a Merit Lage,
Mm-hmm.
out of fear of me casting natural order. And I think that you get to sort of use that, for now at least, you get to use that inexperience that some players have to your advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think even in a world where this deck is a fully known quantity and people have practice against it, there are
Mm-hmm.
still just situations where you can strongly represent that you have a natural order and force them to dedicate their whole game plan to not dying, when in reality it's about you just playing some knuckleheads and getting in there.
That I'm glad you really you mentioned that because that I think the bluff equity, if you want to call it that, of this deck is really under appreciated slash known because unlike the traditional elves nettle build where you can just like win out of nowhere, this deck has that to an extent too, and I don't think people realize how to leverage that correctly. For instance, the thing that comes to mind the most is like against some of these Fury decks where they're just waiting for you to, commit your board. Sometimes you don't have natural order in your hand, but you can still just play out one creature on turn two, and that's a dork, right? And represent 4 mana on turn three. And is your opponent really gonna not call your bluff that you don't have natural order in hand? Like, I'm assuming you're talking about along those lines, right?
Right. Like you just playing a Fiend Artisan on turn two, they have to kill it. They have to use their Fury on it.
Hmm.
And Invigorate punishes that even harder.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad the invigorate tech worked as well as as hype, so to speak, right? Like I know it's gonna draw some raised eyebrows, so to speak, right? Because okay, you're not an infect deck. Why are you playing invigorate that has traditionally
Right.
not been even associated with our deck? If that makes sense.
Um, and I know the comparison is easy to make because of the Invigorates and the Hierarchs, but
Hmm.
one of the things that I think really helped me sort of get in the zone and have these moments of realization of how this deck worked was the context of this being kind of like Tom Ross Infect. And I don't know if you've watched much of Tom Ross's old SCG coverage
Very little,
playing
but
that deck.
I'm familiar with the deck.
He was a cowboy. Like he would play games that he would win games that he had no business winning because he made the game all about something that it wasn't,
Hmm.
and then would just flip up two invigorates into berserk, or like, he would flip up like a daze on like a crucial spell, so he could get landfall on his groundswell. Like just he used every part of the buffalo all the time. He always was willing to take risks when he needed to, and he knew his deck better than his opponents would ever know his. And I think that you really get rewarded for that. And sort of one of my like final points about process for this was I think I could not have had the success I had with this deck if I hadn't spent a lot of time over the last few years just growing as a Magic player.
Mm.
Um, I think that this deck does reward having just like a pretty good knowledge of how competitive games and Magic works. A lot of legacy players kind of subsidize their average skill level by being masters of their deck, and I think that's great. I think that's one of the cool things about legacy is someone who doesn't have 20 years of playing and pro tour experience can crush people who are really really excellent at Magic generally because they know exactly how their deck works. And I think that's one of the big draws of legacy. But I think this deck more than most rewards you for both in equal measures.
Hmm.
Like if you're a great Magic player, you can pick up Delver and crush people. I
Right.
don't necessarily know if that's as true with this deck. And I think if you're excellent at understanding Legacy and you're not a reasonably good Magic player, I think you'll still struggle with this deck because a lot of the things that this deck uses are understanding macro versus micro decisions and game plans regarding that, and bluffing and sort of sideboarding as this 75 card deck as opposed to a 60 and a 15. And so if you're struggling with this deck, I'd honestly recommend playing other decks for a bit and sort of getting a better idea of Magic fundamentals, if that makes sense. And I
Hmm.
think that I spent a lot of time working on that, which is what rewarded me with playing this deck.
I'm so glad you answered the way you did right now, or actually mentioned all of this because twofold. I know a lot of players struggle with this deck, and I have personally struggled not with the deck, but with trying to help players specifically against the control matches because in terms of role assignment, control is different than a lot of the other matchup profiles in how we address the matchup. And I think that's where a lot of the pilots struggle because playing against like Initiative or Delver, like Rug Delver or Grixis Delver, like they're not too much different from each other. Whereas Control, I think, leverages a different skill set that maybe some of these players or pilots either haven't realized or unaware they're supposed to be utilizing. And I'm glad you mentioned this too because I'm not sure if you watched the previous stream or aware of it, but Simon, who top eight the or top four the European Eternal Weekend, I asked him how much he prepped for this for the event, and he actually said he only played one LGS 5 round event, and aside from that, basically was cold going into the event. But he also mentioned his history was he played a lot of limited and pretty much had 20 years of Magic history and was able just to leverage strong fundamentals. And it sounds like That is kind of what you're advocating for anybody who's maybe struggling with the deck. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and honestly, I think if you're struggling against the control matchup, playing the control deck a little bit or playing Delver and kind of understanding how tempo games against control work in a more direct analog will help you. Like experience is translational. It's not always one to one, but like I
Mm-hmm.
said earlier, playing Pokemon video game tournaments got me in a space where I was better at playing Legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And realizing that all of these skills are somewhat transferable and figuring out which ones are, which ones aren't, and how to translate them is ultimately what makes a good Magic player, not just a good Cradle Control player.
I love that answer too because I think I mentioned in the Discord, right? I don't think it's a coincidence you did well, and I don't think it's a coincidence Simon did well because I do think, and while I haven't been able to articulate it, and you've articulated, much better than I could have ever. I, one of the things I'm glad about having you on is you're able to articulate some of the things I've for a long time been trying to um, tell other Magic players, but have struggled in doing it effectively. And I think what you said there helps a lot in terms of just being a good Magic player and not trying to just cheese win, so to speak.
Yeah, I put a lot of skill points into talking well in life and not a lot of points in other places, so I'm glad I can really bring that up when I need to.
No, that it's been very helpful. I think you articulate it in a way that I'm able to maybe reference other players in the future. I definitely will be recommending this stream for anybody who is trying to learn the deck because I think you've done a fantastic job of answering not only my questions but just in general how you view the deck and how to play the deck. And I think that is probably going to be really helpful for anybody trying to pick up the deck going forward.
Uh, One thing that I really emphasize for players who are trying to have like their first big level up moments or break past their first plateaus
Mm-hmm.
is Magic theory is something we don't get a lot of content for these days. So much of it is deck specific. And, you're someone who I think has a really good handle on Magic theory, but for the most part, it seems like your content is deck specific. And you're sort of getting more into the theory stuff with the sideboard maps having like matchup notes and like what it's about. And I think that's really great.
Mm-hmm.
Um, do you mind if I plug a couple of old Magic articles that I think are theory things that are really, to me, fundamental in understanding process, even if they're not direct analogs?
No, oh yeah, feel free to plug anything. How do you want to do it? Do you want to just put the link in the Twitch, or if you want to share a screen, I can put the screen up too.
I'll
Either way.
just I can just say the name and we can type the name of the article because some of them are like only archived on SCG.
Sure.
Most of the things I'm going to be talking about are like 6+ years old
Okay.
at minimum. But Who's the Beatdown by Michael
Mike Flores.
Flores is a classic Magic article about role assessment and specifically talking about mid-range decks and when you're the beatdown and when you're the control player.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. This is the
that was
article I
actually
referenced the most too, for what it's worth. So I'm glad you brought that up first.
and I people love to meme on the article and make jokes about it, but some of it's a little bit rudimentary now that we've had an extra 15 or what 20 years almost to develop on it, but
Mm-hmm.
it still is a piece of fundamental Magic theory. And I think the other side of this coin is actually another old SCG article by Richard Feldman called The Dark Art of Dredge Fu.
Okay. Let me Google that.
Um, yeah, it's like a
Fel.
3,000.
Is
Yeah,
it
three. Richard
FELD or no D MAN?
DMAN. It is just an exceptionally long piece about pre-Faithless Looting Legacy Dredge. But what it really does for me is it's an article about linear decks and
Mm-hmm.
understanding your game plans and fearless sideboarding.
Mm-hmm.
Like, for example, we could play a bunch of dismembers and try and beat an opposition agent, but why would we? Why don't we just try and beat everybody in the aggregate? This is one of the articles where you read it and very little of it is translatable one-to-one to modern Magic, but there are
Mm-hmm.
things in it that I think if you can read them and you can understand the message that he's trying to impart about when you're a linear deck, you have to know what you're doing and commit to it. Like if I'm playing against, Storm, I can't sometimes want to have a Plague Engineer in my deck in case they empty the Warrens. I should just focus on Thoughtseizing them, Gaddock-Teeging them, and then killing them.
That I okay. I think you do a very good job explaining that because it kind of goes back to what you said where This deck is secretly just a deck of a lot of linear game plans that you can just switch to a different one that is fitting for your opponent. So that's a great way of putting that.
And I think that in the Dark Art of Dredge Fu, the section that really uh, to me is the most important is when he talks about in Dredge, the only games you always lose are the ones where you don't get started. And in our deck, the games we lose are the ones where we don't develop our mana, which is like why we play 8 Hierarchs. And that's why Richard Feldman advocated for playing 12 Dredge spells at minimum.
I love that you use this example too because I don't advertise this because it just hasn't been relevant, I guess, in conversation. But I actually own Legacy Dredge, and something that gets talked about a lot is just like the consistency in dredges, having all 12 dredgers, right? Like, I think I'm glad you brought that up because that's a great analog to why we run the 8 hierarchs. And I've been asked, why don't you run 9 dorks then? And I said, the reason why I don't run 9 dorks is because the first Landlord or Bop, really Landlord, is significantly worse than a hierarch. If there was a way to
Right.
run maybe, if Abzan hierarch ever got printed, maybe we run 9. I don't know. But that's the
Right.
reason why I don't run more than 8.
When they print Noble Anarchist, I'll play a ninth copy. Um, the other article series I want to shout out is the entire body of work of Jadine Klumperens. I'll actually put her name in the Discord here so you can copy and paste it. I'll just put it in the Twitch chat, actually. That makes more sense.
Yeah, that's perfect. That makes life easier for me. And actually, I'll put both links here on Twitch chat as well since I have it up.
Um, Jay Dean is now a senior game dev for Wizards of the Coast in the play design department. But before that, she was a Star City tournament grinder and wrote a lot of Magic theory for Star City games. And she has a really good way of articulating abstract concepts that I'll go back and read her pieces from time to time. I think she has like 2 or 3 pieces that are really just like, here's a sideboard guide. I had to write an article this week. But for the most part, everything she wrote has some nugget of genius in it that I think is a useful piece of study material. And sort of taking little bits and pieces from all of these articles and years of experience and getting the opportunity to play against great players like Jay Wojciechowski and reigning North American Legacy champ TK,
Mm-hmm.
players like DSIT who plays Cradle Control, and being in an area with a lot of legacy players where I get to play high level 4 stakes legacy often is really like that confluence of things
Mm-hmm.
is responsible for my success. Not to mention a brilliant deck designer coming up with the initial list and giving me
Thank
some
you.
some sweet tech in the crop rotation Crocus and innovating the Invigorate because no one wins a tournament by themselves as much as we like to pretend Magic is an individual game.
Uh-huh.
Your success is the collective effort of everyone around you and everyone who's taught you and everyone who has defeated you and challenged you to get better. And I think you can't get better at this game without humility.
Mm. That's well spoken.
Um,
That's well put.
and this is kind of like my last shout out. Like I just want to thank all of the people who contributed to this because Eternal Weekend is a tournament I've wanted to do well at more than any other my entire career, and I've played Magic for 22 years now.
I am
Um,
that hearing that actually warms my heart too because I'll be honest, like in terms of like knowing who's who in the Magic community, I'm like pretty naive because age wise I'm kind of a boomer, but like Magic wise, I don't think I played really competitively, and I still don't really consider Legacy to be honest a quote unquote competitive format. Like I kind of lucked my ways, not luck, but you know what I mean. I coincidentally got my way into winning the showcase qualifier in 2020 when it was never really my intention to like make it to a pro tour. If that makes sense. And um, I'm glad you did that because it warms my heart that you were able to fulfill your biggest goal in terms of your Magic career. And with respect to Jadine, which site did she write the majority of these articles for? Just so the Twitch chat is aware.
StarCityGames.com.
Gotcha.
Some of her stuff might be fully archived. I'm not sure. I had to use the Wayback Machine to find the last piece of hers I wanted to find.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a bit of a hunt, and over the next couple of days, if I have a chance, I'll try and find a couple of her pieces and link them to you, and you can add them in the Discord maybe.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I do think I remember I had a follow up question for something you mentioned earlier. You mentioned you had the aha eureka moment in the middle of the event itself. What for I guess for people trying to pick up this deck or just from a Magic Theory slash becoming a better player moment, what was it specifically that made you realize how this deck was supposed to be played?
Um, Let me look at my matchups again. I think it was against the second lands player, um, where I realized that every matchup I knew exactly how to sideboard,
Mm-hmm.
and that I had a plan for every matchup, and that I had not really. This is going to sound bad, but I didn't really have to try that hard in any of my matches because I was just sort of performing something that I had practiced.
Mm-hmm.
Because I knew my role in every matchup. Oftentimes, when I'm playing formats like Standard or even Modern, where there's a lot more granularity in, in Standard, you just have like weird mid-range threats, and every game is so soupy. There's very,
Mm-hmm.
very rarely do you have a game where it's just like, this is what I'm supposed to do every turn, and you know what it is without really thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's sort of a feature of Legacy is that you get to play certain decks and certain matchups enough times. And I think it's a credit to the list that you developed that is just so clean with the sideboard and every matchup and every plan is so tight and well executable that I feel like I didn't have to try in most of my matches more so than I got to focus on the last 20%. The first 80% was free because of preparation and quality of list that I got to
Mm-hmm.
focus on high level stuff like actually interacting with my opponent as a competitor and not just our game pieces interacting. And I don't necessarily mean personally. I mean like I got to do things like make my opponent think the game was about an Elvish Reclaimer when it was about an Endurance in my hand, something like that.
Yeah, I wow, that's really a big compliment to me. I appreciate that first of all, and I guess the second thing is like the ability to recognize that in the middle of the event that your preparation means that now all of the role assignments have, for for lack of a better term, the term you used was free, right? Like now you just need to execute the game plan. That makes, I guess, it's funny too because I think this deck is a very difficult deck actually to play because of the different roles you can that's required in different matchups. But if you're able to figure out the role, then execution is actually significantly easier because everything's already defined. I think that's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, spending a lot of brain power in a game on figuring out what your definition of your role is cumbersome and it's sort of that combination of I have a lot of good heuristics from being a long time player. I have a lot of experience with this deck in particular because I put a lot of work in that I got to spend 90% of my mental energy working on the hardest 20% of each game,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to and when I play modern, I'm spending mental energy on weird, like which card do I Court of Calling for in Yawgmoth, or
Mm-hmm.
which removal spell am I supposed to play in four color? And I think that's actually, as someone in chat said, it's a huge benefit in an 11 round event. Day one being 9 rounds. I'm someone who used to play a lot of SCG Opens, and 9 rounds didn't used to phase me. But then I spent 2 years indoors,
Mm-hmm.
and actually, a couple of weeks after the Legacy Pit Open last year, I caught a pretty bad case of COVID, and I found myself having a lot of endurance issues and struggling to even play a single league on Moto.
Right.
And
Oh wow.
the being able to play 9 rounds with that level of preparation and not really feeling that exhausted after it was both sort of a triumph of personal redemption, but also, you know, I have to imagine this is just like what Reed Duke feels like every event he plays, because he gets to put in the time to do the work to get good enough at the deck that he doesn't have to think about the nitty gritty. He gets to focus on like, how am I beating my opponent, not how are my cards beating my opponent's cards.
That is a fantastic way to put it. And I think on that note, also, um, I wanted to actually mention that. So I have people that I talk to every day just for fun or just sometimes about the deck. And I don't know if you know who Jonathan Zhang is. He's most known for being a dirty Neo brand Griselbrand player, but I showed him the feedback that the responses to my questions, and something that and I wanted to let you know personally what he said was he loved the way you answered the 10th question in terms of you said this deck is a deck of plans and full disclosure, he doesn't typically play this deck, but he recently, I want to say a few months ago, he had the all access pass and he picked up a couple 5-0s and he said this deck is completely different than what I thought it was going to be. But he appreciated that essentially it was role assignment, like what we talked about, right? Every matchup, you kind of have to know what your role is, and then board accordingly, and then execute the plan instead of trying to do a little bit of everything and just master. Sorry, what is the word? Phrase I'm looking for? The jack of all trades but master of none. This is not really that type of deck because I often hear this deck being labeled as a mid-range deck. It can be, but that's not really how the deck is meant to be played. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I I think a lot of the people who kind of see this deck and they see the cards that remind them of Nick Fit and Maverick.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't get me wrong, I love to call Fiend Artisan Nightmare of the Reliquary, but it's really not that. It really just is. It's all about leveraging Gaia's Cradle. It's all about leveraging the fact that you get to play 14 one-mana spells, but effectively 8 more in the form of Green Sun Zenith.
Mm-hmm.
Things like Once Upon a Time, that is just like a fundamentally broken card that you have to really build your deck around.
Mm-hmm.
I think that a lot of players sort of see the things that they want to see in the deck and they pick it up because of it, and it's not exactly what they expected. And there's nothing wrong with that. But the success with this deck, I think, has come from players who sort of see past the dazzle and the glitz and sort of just see, wow, we're playing 8 Hierarchs because we want to always play Putrid Imp on turn 1, discard a Golgari Grave Troll, right? We want to play Noble Hierarch on turn 1, follow it up with 2 more 1-drops, a Guy's Cradle, and an Endurance.
Mm-hmm.
We want to maximize for the best case scenario and optimize for the worst case scenario. And Hierarchs do that. And it's weird that like a conservative deck building style like that actually kind of ends up giving you more free wins. But it does. Like when you don't spend your time playing a bunch of bullets that don't meaningfully impact things. Like of the bullets in the deck, I barely want to play the ones that we have. I think the ones that we have are correct. But like the only reason Bowmaster has stayed in is because oftentimes you need to make 2 bodies off an artisan. That to me is the reason it's in the deck.
Yeah, I'm glad you're mentioning that too because that is like one of the most commonly asked, as you can probably imagine, right? Questions that I get asked is just like, "Oh, you're a Gaia's Cradles deck. You're a Fiend Artisan deck. Why are you not playing more copies of Bowmasters?" And the long story short is, it's just not what the deck is about.
Yeah. When it first got printed, I tried a list with 4 of them, and I kept losing to Delver, a matchup where you expect it to be good.
Right.
But I just wasn't drawing gas. And also, Bowmaster is worse in a deck when you're playing a bunch of Hierarchs because multiple bodies does not attack as well.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, you can still leverage them in other ways, but it's just not what it's about. Endurance really is what the deck is about, though, right? It's just a card that does something for like 3 different game plans, and it's your best card in some matchups, and it's just barely bad enough to take out in others.
Right. It's some. The nice thing about endurance is it's not at its best. Let's just say against something like DNT or Control, right, where it's just like a 3 mana 3/4 flash. But it has the chance to be where combined with the hierarch triggers, like the opponent who's been saving their Swords of Plowshares for your Fiend Artisan the whole game, suddenly now is at a life total where they actually have to spend it on the endurance, and you've actually gotten full value. Whereas like other situational cards are just not it. And then again, against something like if you draw it naturally against something like Reanimator, it just literally wins the game.
Right, right. It just is. The 3/4 is just so big.
Mm-hmm.
We have a couple of minutes left. Do you want to try and sneak in a couple of quick questions before I have to go?
Sure. I asked. I think okay. So I had a couple follow up questions that I already so I took notes of, and I definitely wanted to give you the praise that Jonathan Zhang mentioned that he really liked your description of a deck of game plan, and especially linear game plans is more like it. Going off my notes. Okay. Here is one that I haven't asked. Um, what matchups do you not really want to see with respect to this deck? And I know you said the control matchup feels close. I'm assuming you think it's pretty even as well, or do you feel slightly unfavored?
I feel like it's even. I think the Jeskai Ocean Soul list is we're disadvantaged, but I think against Beanstalk decks we're pretty even because they're clunky.
Hmm. And then what about in
Um,
general? If there's any matchups, I joke that I don't want to play against anything with Rite of Flame in it, but if you
yeah.
wanted to,
Honestly, I think a lot of the Storm decks aren't as bad as they used to be because a lot of them are playing things like Urza's Saga to fuel Beseech the Mirror, and actually, Bryant, who I played against in top eight, his
uh,
Storm list I think is probably the scariest deck in the format for me. He's not playing Rite of Flame, but he's not playing Urza Saga, which is the other thing. And my lines of interaction are just Thoughtseize, just Gaddock Teeg, just Collector Roof.
hmm.
And our match on camera, he really showed in game two just how fragile my hold on the game can be. I got incredibly fortunate against him, peeling Collector Roof in game three after a Thoughtseize,
Hmm.
and then him brainstorm locking. But like I think the matchup I want to play against the least in the entire format is Bryant Cook specifically on Tess, and then followed by every other Tess player.
That tracks because like they are more explosive than Ant, which we have more tools against, right? Like we the graveyard hate that package like is very strong with us with respect to Reclaimer and Endurance, whereas Brian Cook's TES list is a little bit more immune or can bypass that more easily. Um, I know some people believe the I guess two other decks that are there people are somewhat afraid of are the show and tell decks and the mono black decks. How do you personally feel about them?
I think the mono black deck is just kind of mopey at a baseline.
Hmm.
Obviously, they have four copies of the best card against you in Opposition Agent, and Bowmaster's still good against you, but
Hmm.
it's weird where I think the worst part of that matchup for them is their own deck. Um,
You mean that they can lose to themselves, right?
right, yeah, yeah, like the fact that they can just draw a hand that's all about Leyline Helm, and then you draw two Force of Vigors, or even just one Force of Vigor, or they draw like if they're the Chalice build, they play a Chalice and you just draw a Shepherd.
Hmm.
Um, and Sneak and Show is a matchup that I think is very, very bad, but I think the deck is just kind of terrible in the format in general.
Hmm.
And so I'm willing to have a bad matchup against a deck that I don't think is great. And obviously, if the format changes and Sneak and Show becomes much more represented, that's maybe a sign to move off of this deck. But even then, um, having a couple of bad matchups in the room is not that bad, right? Like you play a 15 round event, you play against it once, you take your loss, and you go on to win all the other ones, and it's fine. And sometimes it's just not your day, and you play against three of them. Uh,
Yeah, that's kind of
this really
how
is a
I.
deck of averages.
Yeah, that's kind of how I feel too. Like I'm not too concerned about warping the deck just to address a bad matchup and then making all your other matchups worse.
Yeah, this you can honestly just call this deck Moneyball Elves, and it'd be accurate.
That's funny.
I know I made that comment earlier.
I'll go. I'll actually put that on my list. On Moto, you can just like call it what I'll call it Moneyball Elves. Going forward, and then on stream too, just out of respect for you, Cass.
I appreciate that. I I I love Cradle Control as a tongue-in-cheek thing, but every time someone says, "But it's not a control deck," I want to turn inside out.
Yeah,
There's
I'm glad people you realize and other people realize. I'm just joking, right? Like nobody actually thinks this is a control deck, and but it's really weird to me how some people get all bent out of shape just because the control is put, and I only added it just to be honest for alliteration. If that's the true backstory behind that, just because you think of like cruel control, right? Back in the day, I didn't play it or
right.
nor, but I'm like aware of that being the deck and standard, and that was just a tongue in cheek thing, and then it's just really funny to me that people get all bent out of shape when they accept cephalid breakfast as a okay name, so to speak.
Right. Right. I took a shine to calling the deck Cradle Comrades for a bit because you got creatures all kinds of types. You got goblins and humans and elves and dinosaurs all living together.
That's pretty funny. I've actually had people joke with me. Obviously, I think the people who are more reasonable, obviously, you can have a good conversation and a good laugh about. But somebody joked with me recently that, man, I thought if you played Plague Engineer against a Cradle deck, that's supposed to be lights out. What's going on? I want my refund from MTGO.
Yeah. I actually do you know Dave Long?
I know of Dave Long. I never had the chance to meet him.
He's local, and I play with a lot of non-English cards in my deck, specifically Korean cards.
Uh huh.
and he played a plague engineer, and with it on the stack, he had to ask what type all of my creatures were. He was like, what's ignoble hierarch? It's a goblin wizard, it's goblin shaman. And there's just like no overlapping creature types. Sometimes they can get, if you have two of the same thing, they can get two of them, but for the most part, engineer just like names dryad or goblin or human, and you
I
just
think the
play
best.
on.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
I just you just kind of play on through it most of the time.
Yeah, I think the best name is either Dryad, Shaman, because you can hit, Shepherd or
Hmm.
Ignoble, and then or sometimes Insect because Gris can run away the game, right?
Yeah, that is true.
I know we're at 2 minutes over. Is there anything from Twitch chat or I'll leave the floor to you, Cass, if you want to add or plug anything else.
No, I'm really glad you had me on. It's I'm terrible about sitting down and writing an article, and I wanted to write a tournament report of some kind, but this will be a good stand-in, and it'll give you some benefit too as the person who put in a lot of the groundwork to do the lion's share of the deck development. Um, I just want to say thanks again to everybody who contributed because, like I said, nobody wins a tournament alone, and shout out to you, Newton, and the whole DMV area Magic community. Uh, I'm really grateful for the opportunity to get to play events like this, and doing well Eternal Weekend was really a dream come true. As someone who's played a lot of tournaments, and Eternal Weekend is the great one. It is for me the prestige of Legacy. Um, I
That
feel really
that
fortunate.
uh, uh, um, that really is touching to hear, and I appreciate you shouting me out. I know I don't know what it is, but sometimes I feel like this deck, like the image that some of the some legacy players have of it is I don't know why there's so much negativity sometimes, and maybe it's just because people are frustrated because they can't play, I don't know, Glimpse of Nature anymore, or it's just not what they think a guy's Kratos deck's supposed to be. But I appreciate you, you know, mentioning me there, and I also want to what is, I also want to congratulate you once again and thank you for coming on stream. I think I personally got a lot out of this stream just with talking from you, and I think anybody who is interested in getting better, not even as a quote unquote Cradle Control player, but just as a Magic player in general, should really listen to this stream. And I will definitely post it and obviously shout you out for coming on and being flexible, especially with the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Like I said, you got a newborn-ish. I think it's been about a year, right?
It's been just over 6 months.
Oh wow, yeah. So yeah, I make my own hours. I work for myself, so being flexible is the least I can do. And again, thanks for having me on. It's not often I get to just talk about Magic and not be interrupted by my podcast co-hosts.
Uh huh. I think the one thing too is you mentioned the Eternal Weekend being the best event. I've only played in one Eternal Weekend, and that was the 2021 online one, just
Hmm.
because it fit my time schedule, and I top aided that one with the Reclaimer Elves, and I don't know if you know Aaron Relentless, but you're actually won the Bayou event the very next day, and it was kind of the coming out party for the Reclaimer Elves version, still with Glimpse of Nature, but one day I hope to be able to play an in paper one. I jokingly have mentioned on stream before that's I'm gonna put my 100% top eight conversion rate on the line, but that's okay. I'd like to meet you and others who have been looking forward to the paper play after COVID started again in the near future, hopefully.
Yeah, if there's ever another Eternal Weekend in Pittsburgh and you come on out, well, I'm sure the Steel City will welcome you, and I'd love to get a chance to meet you and the whole East Coast Legacy contingent. I'm sure would you got to show these people how it's done. You really gotta. But West Coast, you're West Coast, right?
I'm in just east of Los Angeles, so just outside Los Angeles County.
Yeah. People don't respect West Coast Magic enough anymore. You gotta come show these kids how it's done.
I gotta update the list too because the it's not even a secret. It's known that my paper deck is completely outdated. I think the last time I updated was like I added the shepherds, but that's like ages ago.
Actually, the real prize for this event was for Eternal Weekend was I've spent the last 6 months or so looking for a Korean layer of the Hydra to finish my deck.
Uh huh.
And I was unable to find one. And then finally, after winning and making a post about it, someone happened. I finally got enough traction that we found one, and my $50 bounty on a $1.29 card finally came to fruition, and it's on the way. And the deck will finally be complete after almost a full year of looking for cards for it.
That's so funny. Speaking of Twitter, I saw that and I was really happy for you. And then I want to mention also one other thing that brought me delight. And then you can confirm whether that was the case or not. But I didn't want to jinx it because I'm like strangely superstitious, and I didn't want to jinx your run when you were in the middle of I think you were undefeated at the time. But let me bring up your tournament, like I guess live updates if that makes sense. Uh,
Oh, yeah, the thread, yeah.
okay, here's the thread,
Uh,
and this big brain cyborg tech. When I saw this, I was like, I wonder if she had something that I'm not aware of. And then I know your list was 74 out of 75, so I've got to assume. Were you talking about the invigorate here?
yeah, in it was in the game three where I used the Invigorate to sort of just catch my opponent off guard and lock them under their own idol on the Great Revel.
Yeah,
Uh,
that's kind of what I assumed based on the conversation we had earlier. But I'm not gonna lie, seeing this, well, realizing that you're on 74 of the 75, and then cross correlating with your original tweet, and then thinking that was the invigorate, definitely brought a smile to my face because very rarely do I see somebody implicitly at least say I don't like to boast, or I try to be humble whenever I can, but like seeing that definitely brought a smile to my face.
it really is. I think it was the innovation of the event. It didn't win me a lot of games just because of the matchups I played,
Right.
but the games where I cast an Invigorate were easily like the games that I would never have won with any other card.
I'm glad you mentioned that too because like I said, I'm sure there's gonna be a lot of side eye or like raised eyebrows, but I'm glad it worked out the way that it was intended. If that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, again, thank you for all the work you put in on the deck. It is a ton of fun, and also I think it's just really good.
I'm glad you think so, and I hope to see you with continued success with this deck. And then, if there are no other questions from the stream, I'd like to leave the final word to you if you want to, anything else you want to add.
Um, I guess my closing statement will be I'm probably taking a little bit of a break from Magic for a couple of weeks just to kind of spend time with family and spend some time cooking. But if you see me at an event ever in the future, just come up and say hi. I don't bite. I love meeting people, and Legacy is great, and more people should play it and build your local communities because that's how you get better at Magic. That's my soapbox.
All right. Without further ado, I guess we're wrapping up this stream now, and I hope to see your you know cuisines on Twitter in the future.
Oh, I'll be sure to post pictures. Don't you worry.
Okay. Is there anybody in particular you want me to raid or no?
No, whoever you feeling. Yeah.
Okay. Let me see. Since we want to be just better Magic players, I think it makes sense to raid the Ham TV who's drafting. I think that's one area I know I can improve on, and I think a lot of people can improve on as well. And that will make you just an overall better Magic player instead of just a quote unquote specialist, so to speak, right?
Yeah. Draft is great to learn combat. All right.
Okay, we're in 5 seconds. I guess we'll be going over, and then we'll be out.